This is Linda. Today we're going to try and tell you the story of her life. The name Linda means beautiful, and I think you'll agree with us that it's a beautiful story. To help us tell the story is one of the most outstanding artists of our time, Bob Tommy. Bob has been privileged to work with such famous people as the late Marlon Perkins, Herman Lay, Tex Ritter, Hank Thompson, Elvis Presley, and many, many others. Today, he's working with somebody who is not famous with anybody but Jesus. Bob, thank you very much, and we'll be watching.
From the studios in Joplin, Missouri, Good News Productions International presents Venture in Faith. Outstanding Christians of our generation telling their own story of how God has worked in their lives. Your host, Boyce Moten.
I asked Stan if he would hold the camera on Bob Tommy as he does this initial sketching. I'm amazed that within less than an hour he's going to have a picture completed. He's a remarkable man and one of many hundreds, maybe even thousands of individuals who work as volunteers for the Ministry of Good News Productions International. And I guess one of the reasons why we're doing this program today is that without Linda, there would be no Good News Productions International here in Joplin, Missouri. Let's talk about Linda. Helen, where were you when Linda was born?
We were living in Africa at the time. We were serving as missionaries at Chitamoyo Mission in what was then Rhodesia, what is now called Zimbabwe.
You had children already?
Yes, we had two, Carolyn and Tom.
And you had no trouble with the other children?
That's correct.
And yet you felt like you wanted to give yourself a little space, so you were going to go in 5 weeks early to the hospital. You were a couple of 100 miles from the hospital?
Yes, that's right. And we had packed our things and made arrangements to stay in the home of one of the missionary families who were gone on furlough at that time. So we were planning to leave early the next morning.
But you left earlier than you anticipated.
Yes, that's right, because in the middle of the night I started into labor. So we were thankful that we were already packed anyway, ready to leave. And so we left about 3 o'clock in the morning.
Ziden, what kind of a trip was it?
Well, the first 55 miles is all gravel. That's over streams, no bridges or anything like that. That normally took about 3 hours just to do that first 55 miles. But we made the entire 200 miles in about 3 hours and 15 minutes. We had a fan belt to break on the way, and that was all included in that time. So it was a very quick journey.
And an uncomfortable one for you, Helen, I'm sure. The area was quite remote. I want to just ask you a little bit about the mission work there before we continue on with Linda's story. I understand that the mission work was going well?
Yes, going extremely well. We had gone into the area in 1961 to the area of Chief Dandawa. It was a newly settled area. In fact, Chief Dandawa was one of several chiefs that had been moved out of the Zambezi Valley when they built the Zambezi River into what is now Kariba Lake. But the giant Kariba Dam, where years ago, in fact 100 years before it was built, David Livingstone said there ought to be something here to catch the water that would keep water here for the people to have the year round. Anyway, it was that type of area. Chief Dandawa had many sub-chiefs under him. He was responsible for about 250,000 people himself. Very primitive area, no schools or anything like that in the area when we went in.
You were happy in the work?
Very happy, yes.
The work was prospering?
Yes. And
you had how many churches?
Well, in the 14 years that we were there were 105 churches established in the areas that we worked, and that was largely because of the Africans being so thirsty and hungry for the gospel of Christ, and they would hear of Christ. They would go out into the areas then and get a few people together, then many people together, and so it was going very well with Christian day schools. A major hospital was built there in Dendawa's area, and it was all very exciting work.
So you had no idea of ever leaving Africa. This was your home.
That's correct.
You had wanted to be missionaries since you were a young boy, 7 or 8 years old?
Yes, I think 8 years old when I said to God, if you can use somebody like me in Africa one day, I'll be happy to go.
And Helen, you were happy on the mission field.
Yes, that's right. In fact, Ziden had said that he wouldn't date anyone except someone he knew would be interested in going to the mission field with him.
So you were at the place where you thought God wanted you to be, and it would have taken a miracle to get you away from there. And in a way, I guess Linda is a miracle. So you get to the hospital, and Linda's born. How much did she weigh?
She weighed 5 pounds and 2 ounces.
Which was, in a way, for a baby over a month premature, that was a big baby.
That's right.
Did the doctor anticipate any problem? Did everything seem to be going well?
Right, except after she was born, they put her in what they called the quiet corner of the nursery. They just had a huge room for a nursery, and all of the babies were put together in there. And he said it was not because she looked like a preemie, but she acted like a preemie. So it was common to stay at least a week in the hospital there anyway, but we stayed for 10 days to be sure that she was nursing right, and then we left thinking everything was all right.
And we're going to be talking very frankly, and I think I should point out to you, our viewers, that we're set up in such a way that Bob and Linda cannot hear what we're talking about. But Linda was born with brain damage.
Right.
How long was it, Helen, before you knew that?
Well, I think that we began to suspicion that there was something wrong when she was about 1.5 years old. And we had taken her during that first year to be checked by a pediatrician in Salisbury, which was the capital city, a very competent pediatrician. And he assured us that there wasn't anything wrong with her, that she was just a little bit slower in developing, but that she would catch up. But by the time she was 3, we knew that she was farther behind than she should be at that time.
What was your initial reaction?
Well, I think earlier we thought she will catch up sometime, but then we realized that she wouldn't. And I think we didn't really know what to expect because we had not had any kind of an evaluation done at that time. We just knew that she was slower than she should be.
Now, Ziden, you are so articulate about the technical aspect of this. Would you explain to us what was wrong with Linda's thinking apparatus?
Well, we found out later that what had been taking place since she was born was that there were polyspikes in the electrodes of the brain. It was illustrated to us by saying that if a sentence is spoken, normally a person hears every word. In Linda's case, the polyspikes were so frequently happening that she might miss 2 or 3 words out of every sentence that she would hear. And that explained why in her early years, Helen said, well, Linda does have a memory. And she was getting some things, but most things she was not getting. And they told us there that she probably would never learn anything, that she had no capability of memory. But her mother said, there are things that she remembers. I know she can.
Now, Rhodesia at this time was in a very volatile political situation. Could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Well, in the very year that Linda was born, 1966, the first Rhodesian citizens were killed by insurgents from the north. In fact, it happened just a few miles from where we were living, about 4 or 5 miles from where we were living. There were 7 Rhodesian citizens killed by the insurgents from the north. And so we were right in the midst of a very difficult area, a lot of turmoil with, terrorists or freedom fighters camped in caves nearby.
Now, that would have been enough to make a lot of missionaries leave. If God wanted you out of Rhodesia, one way to do it was to have political instability and missionaries being slaughtered, but you weren't leaving.
No, we didn't feel there was any reason to. The African people, in fact the chiefs, had assured us that they would take care of us and that the people coming in from the north were not after missionaries as such.
And so you were just going to stay. But the situation with Linda, and I want to come back to this, that there would be no Good News Productions International here in Joplin, Missouri without Linda. And she was the vehicle which God used to bring you back to the States. So Linda is now 3 years old. You know something is wrong, but a lot of people have things wrong with them. So that didn't, the thought of leaving Africa didn't enter your mind. As a matter of fact, I've been told that you were ready to even renounce your U.S. citizenship to stay in Rhodesia.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, what happened to affect this transition?
I'm not sure if we can get enough of the story in here, but basically what happened was that we felt we had everything that the people in Zimbabwe had or Rhodesia had at that time, and therefore, since we were living with them, we shouldn't have any advantage simply because we were USA citizens. So we made the determination, and perhaps I should say I made almost a unilateral determination that we would stay in Zimbabwe. Helen's parents from near Nevada, Missouri, came over in 1972 with the idea of saying, why not bring her back to the USA and see if something couldn't be done. They got there, they were so impressed with the work that Helen's dad, Marvin Faulkner, told me later, I really didn't have the heart to go ahead and say what we partially came to say, and that was to consider bringing Linda back. But then in 1973, they sold a piece of property even and sent us a check and said, would you please consider bringing our granddaughter back to the USA and see if something could be done. But even then, I didn't see that that would lead to us leaving Africa. I thought we might get some help in the USA, maybe some medication. You know, she might be helped, but I felt like I had a responsibility to the family to at least do what the requests were.
So out of just a courtesy to your relative, you said, okay, I'll bring Linda back. But we've got doctors in Rhodesia, we've got hospitals in Rhodesia, we're working with the people. Why should we separate ourselves from them by something which they have not access to?
That's a perfect summary.
All right, tell us about the trip. Now, Helena had to stay home and keep the kids in school, help with the mission work, and you and Linda came back to the States.
Linda probably remembers the trip better than I do. We've gone down several interstates, years later, and she will say, Daddy and I stayed there. And it was exactly true, and I really had forgotten it. But anyway, we came to the States, and we're here for 5 weeks. We went to a doctor at Raytown Clinic in Raytown, Missouri. He put her in a hospital there, had people come and check her, did all the testing, and that's when they found the polyspikes in the electrodes of the brain. So during those 5 weeks, I was amazed to see that the medication they started her on within just a few hours had brought those polyspikes under control to where her attention span, was many minutes longer than it had been previous to her going on that medication.
Okay, I understand that you made a long-distance phone call clear to Africa to tell Helen about it.
Yes, in fact, it was about, I think, 3 o'clock in the morning, USA time, but I was so excited about it, and back then, the phone service wasn't what it is today, and it took several hours just to get the phone call through because we had to book it with the operator. And, the first thing I did after this happened was to book the call because I wanted to tell Helen what was taking place.
And Helen, what was your reaction?
Oh, I think I was very, very pleased. I just hadn't expected that there would be something concrete that could help.
Did you, at that point, think that you'd be leaving Africa?
I don't think so, no. I don't think we still had considered that.
No.
There was medication, but the medication could be mailed, or you could make some arrangements. And I just have to keep coming back over and over and over this. I really feel that Ziden and Helen are people who are sensitive to the leading of God, and they want to do the will of God, but sometimes God has to get very plain with us, like he did with Simon Peter, when he just had vision after vision after vision trying to get him to go preach to Cornelius. he was reluctant to do it. Finally said, oh, I get it now. Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation him that feareth God and worketh righteousness is acceptable to him. And today, this ministry is communicating the gospel to, dozens and dozens. Well, this is 1987. And how many languages?
Somewhere around 100 languages, just over 100.
Over 100 languages. How many different countries of the world?
67 countries.
67 countries of the world. And it's all happened in such a brief span of time. It never would have happened in Africa, would it?
No.
It would have been impossible to have happened in Africa, and God was leading you. And for the benefit of our viewers who may have afflictions in the family, I don't believe God causes afflictions, but I do believe that God allows them, as he did in the case of Job. Yes. That the devil couldn't do anything to Job without God's permission. And the devil couldn't do anything to Linda unless it crossed God's desk first. But the worst that the devil can do, God somehow has the miraculous power to transform into something very beautiful and very wonderful. It's amazing that crosses are now not an emblem of suffering and shame, but an emblem of hope. And a part of Christian jewelry, or things that people adorn their buildings with. Now, when did you come to grips with the fact you were going to have to leave Africa?
We were scheduled for a furlough to come and visit churches in 1974, just a year later than Linda and I made the journey to the USA. We made the decision that while we were here, we would put her in a special school near to home where she could stay at home where we were living at the time. So she went to a special school and a special ed class as such. And we said, we'll see how she does. Well, about halfway through that furlough, now this is toward the end of 1974, we saw that she was making progress. Now this is something they didn't have in Africa. Yes, they had doctors and other things, but what we found here was a structured program for her particular problem mentally. And she made such good progress that in the midst of that furlough, we said that we just really cannot take her back to Africa where there's no program such as this, and where they said we should just put her in an institution. So we made the decision at that time. Then we went back to Africa for a few weeks, packed all of our belongings, which we had thought we would go back to and stay with, and sent them back to the USA. So it was actually about the early part of 1975 that the decision was made.
Did you have any idea of what you'd do in the States?
No. In fact, that's a very interesting time in my life in particular. I thought about many different things. The rate of conversion in Africa was great. We were seeing, about 1,000 people come to Christ, buried with their Lord in Christian baptism, every year. And we didn't see how we possibly could go into a located ministry where there might only be 15 or 20 or 50. I wasn't sure what I could do. Helen wasn't sure, that I could settle down to a located ministry. We had several offers to do different things in colleges and located ministry, but somehow people who knew us, people knew that other missionaries had said, well, Ziden and Helen, why not help us do the same thing that you were doing in Africa? They knew those requests had come to us while we were still in Africa. And some of the folks at Ozark Christian College got together and they said, look, why don't you at least see if something couldn't be done to respond to the request of other missionaries, set up something here in the USA that might help them. I said I didn't think it could be done, but we prayed about it, investigated several different things, visited several different audiovisual ministries, and finally decided that nothing like that was being done, and maybe we could work out some procedures whereby we could make culturally oriented materials that could be used in various cultures around the world.
One of the things about Linda is this very, very beautiful smile. Helen, I'm sure there have been times in the last 20 years when she didn't smile. Do you mind talking about it?
No, I think just in the last year in particular, she's had a real sweet spirit up to that point, but she's had a lot of physical problems in the last 3 years, and particularly in the last year. And I think that she hasn't felt well, and I think she didn't know how to handle her frustrations. And sometimes she would become really angry, especially with me, because I had to do the things for her that sometimes hurt or sometimes she didn't want to have done. And I think that's been one of the hardest things for me to cope with. She is better at the present time, and we're really thankful for that.
She, at one time, when I first met Linda, she could run and play. Now she can't. What happened?
She started just kind of stumbling, and we knew that there was something wrong, and it seemed like it was getting worse. So we took her to Columbia to a doctor who had seen her a year earlier, and they did a lot of testing and finally decided that she had a condition called peripheral neuropathy, and thought that we would be able to find the cause of that and then take care of the thing that was causing it, and she would be all right again. But even though they did a battery of tests, they were not able to locate just what was causing it.
Ziden, there was some talk about a tumor, and yet the specialists have never really come out and been very specific, have they?
It's been quite confusing even to the specialist voice. In fact, there was a time when she couldn't raise her eyes above the horizontal plane. And so she was sent to Columbia, first of all, to see a well-renowned surgeon, a brain surgeon there. And they did discover that there was an enlarged area in the pineal part of her brain, which is a very difficult part even to consider surgery. In fact, just recently a neurologist said that chances would not be very, very good at all if that surgical procedure had to be done, because it's right in the middle part of the brain. Exactly what it is, they don't know. The confusing thing now is that there are times when Linda still cannot look above horizontal plane, but other times she can. So they don't know if there's a swelling going on in the pineal area and then it reduces itself to where it doesn't affect the eyes, or exactly what's happening. So, they're very puzzled about it also.
She came to the place where she couldn't even walk
That's right.
or crawl. That, I'm sure, presented some problems, because Ziden's gone a lot, I know that. How do you manage, Helen?
Well, I guess we just have strength to do what we have to do. But it was the hardest part was lifting her, like from her wheelchair to the bed and other places that I would have to lift her to. But some people helped us to be able to get some equipment that has been a great help to me. And we got a wheelchair that was smaller so that it could go through the bathroom door, and a bath bench so I didn't have to lift her down into the tub and out, and that's been a big help.
On Wednesday nights we've been studying about Joseph, and I guess if you're in a prison and Potiphar's wife has lied about you and your brothers have betrayed you, it's easy to be negative. We look back on the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors, and it's a beautiful story. Or we think about Jesus, which is the greatest story ever told of the greatest life ever lived. And yet at the time when all the little babies were being killed, or when Joseph and Mary were fleeing into Egypt, or when there was no room in the inn, there must have been some real times of doubt and discouragement. And I'm thinking, Helen, that somebody looking at us, it's a beautiful story about Linda, and we commented that her name means beautiful, and the ministry's beautiful, and God has just done such a great thing. But I know there have been times of discouragement. And I want you, if you can, to tell about one of those times and maybe what helped you to get out of it.
Well, I think probably my lowest points have been when Ziden has been away, because when I can talk to him, that really helps. But he had been gone to India last year, and then he was coming back to Washington, D.C. to go to a couple of conventions there. And it was just at this time that Linda was getting so that she couldn't crawl or help herself at all. And I suppose that was probably my most discouraging time when I called him. And he came back, and she was put in the hospital again at that time too, because she was going through another period of this peripheral neuropathy. But this time she started at the point where she couldn't walk or could just barely walk, so it progressed more quickly this time. I think having him there, having the encouragement of our children, the encouragement of our friends in the church, our friends in the community, especially the people that we work with here at Good News, and just knowing that God does provide the strength that we need for each day was the most encouraging thing. Also, the people from the state school where she attends were most helpful to us, and the physical therapist worked out a program to kind of help her, and the PE teacher even made visits to our home to try to help us with her when she was confined there.
Ziden, you mentioned to me, and I think it's in a way providential, that we're doing this particular video now at the time when an article is coming out in the Christian Standard, which you wrote about Linda. I had no idea you were writing the article, and you had no idea that I was dreaming of this particular venture in faith. But why don't you share with us some of the soul searching that you went through and how you came to write this article?
Well, obviously through the years we've had many thoughts many times, and questioning our own motives in relationship to Linda, wondering the impact of this on our other two children, which, as Helen just said, they handled it beautifully. But I had been asked to write several reflection articles for the Christian Standard, and one was suggested about Linda, and I thought about that one. Well, I spent days and days, and I had to make a trip to Amsterdam to do some lectures there, and all the way over on the plane, about 5 hours, I worked on that article about Linda, all soul-searching, obviously, sitting there trying to hide my tears from all the other passengers as I thought about some of these things, and as I thought over the times that we had put her in an institution for evaluation. It was just a week at a time. And I thought about the times that she cried out at night and would say, "Why do my legs hurt?" And we would go in and try to comfort her. Thought about the times when the crying rang through the corridors at the medical center in Columbia when they were putting these long needles in her muscles trying to determine the exact damage to the nervous system. And so I came up with the idea of pain for a season. And so as I reflected on Helen and my thoughts through the years as we worked with Linda and tried to find different areas that could help, it just seemed like there was so much pain in all of that. But as I reflected on that, it seemed that the reflections became more vivid from the book of Revelation, when John, talking about the people who were being persecuted. Now, we've never felt we were persecuted because of this, but he asked the question, "How long, O Lord, must the righteous suffer?" And I've longed for the time, really, that Linda could be released from her earthly suffering. And so as I reflected on the past, I kept seeing these reflections from the book of Revelation where John is describing when people will be released and God will wipe away all tears and we'll be singing Alleluia, Alleluia. And so I wrote the article entitled Pain for a Season. And I discussed the pain that she's gone through in various times. I discussed the personal perspective that we had. I discussed the peace for the soul. Brent, I described her baptismal experience, which I don't believe was a result of having repented of any sin. I don't think her mental level has really ever brought her into sin, but like Jesus, I think she did it to fulfill all righteousness, at least in my words. Her answer was simply, well, Jesus wants me to, when she kept insisting that she be baptized. So I covered that piece for the soul, and then the last part was obviously peace that will come in the future.
Helen, what does it feel like when you know that when you take her to the doctor and the doctor's going to hurt her? What does that make you feel like as a mama?
It probably hurts me as much as it does her.
I was at a ladies' meeting over on the other side of Coffeyville, Kansas years ago, and a little sweet lady read a poem which was translated from the German language about pain. I'm going to whip it on you if I can remember it. Thou sweet hand of God, that so woundeth my heart, thou maketh me to smile while thou maketh me to smart. It seems as if God were at ball play, and I, the harder he strikes me, the higher I fly. I own it, he bruises, he pierces me sore, but the hammer and chisel afflict me no more. Shall I tell you the reason? It is that I see The sculpture shall carve out an angel of me. So I shrink from no suffering, how painful, sore air, when once I'm convinced that my God's hand is there. For soft on the anvil the iron shall glow, while the smith with his hammer deals blow upon blow. So come then and welcome the blow and the pain. Without them, no mortal to heaven shall attain. For what can the sheaves on the barn floor avail, till the thresher shall beat out the chaff with his flail? He presses me hard, but he gives patience too, and I say to myself, 'tis no more than my due, for no tone from the organ can swell on the breeze, till the organist's fingers press down on the keys. 'Tis only a moment God chastens with pain. Joy follows on sorrow like sunshine on rain. So bear then what God on thy spirit shall lay. Be dumb, and when tempted to murmur, then pray. Well, I was thinking of that as God really doesn't enjoy causing us pain. But he knows that sometimes it's a necessary ingredient, like Jesus, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. And it was not a joyous experience for God in Gethsemane either. So my heart breaks for you, and for the many of our viewers who have little children with birth defects or other problems and go through the soul searching and agony that you have gone through over Linda. I want to remind our viewers again, it's a beautiful story about a little girl with a beautiful name. And I know that your story is going to be beautiful. That somehow God can take the problems, the difficulties, and the pain and transform it into something exceedingly wonderful. Ziden, I understand that something like 1 million people a day are reached for Christ through the ministries of Good News Productions International.
Yes, it's very difficult to determine, but the nearest that we've been able to look at it and very conservatively make estimates of all the cable stations that our videos are on, the hundreds that are watching film strips in hundreds of different villages every night around the world in different tribes, that is somewhere around 1 million a day probably are being influenced by the ministry.
And Linda has a part in all of that.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the latest exciting development in this ministry.
Many people have looked at this ministry and seen the unity of God's people around the world as they work together. And there's been recently this real effort by many people to put together some programming that could go out to many parts of the world. In order to deliver that programming, the most feasible way of doing it was through the satellite communication system that's been developed throughout the world. In fact, over half of the world's population could see on television the Olympic Games. The other half, almost everyone, could have heard it by radio simply because of the satellite communications. So the Board of Directors of Good News Productions International, after several years of research and actual experimentation in the field with NASA, said that we really need to put in an Earth station here at Good News Productions International where we can send out programs across America into many different audience segments. And so, in fact, we've just completed on February 2nd, the testing was done of a 9.1 meter or about 30 feet diameter dish, and all the testing has been completed and we are ready to go.
And from right here, just a few feet from where we're sitting, programs can be beamed to satellites and reflected to other satellites and I guess cover the entire world?
Yes, that's correct.
There is no way that you can jam reception from a satellite? Am I using the correct terminology?
Yes. In fact, we had a call from a man who had been to Russia. This was a couple of years ago. He called, he said, "Ziden, do you realize that the Russians are really worried about you?" And I questioned him further, and what he was saying was that they're worried about satellite communications because there is no way that you can, spread a maze of wires across the sky as they can in microwave signals that go, on a terrestrial plane. they can put up many wires on the borders to block those. But with satellite communications, there's no way to block that. And in fact, around the world, many people, even where it is illegal, have been building their own little dishes. Guys that have some electronic, ingenuity have made their own dishes. In fact, they've even arrested several in Russia who had made portable receiving dishes, put them under their bed during the daytime, and unfolded them like umbrellas at night, and got, programs from around the world.
I think our viewers are probably watching Linda smile at this time, and you wonder if maybe she does it somehow subconsciously understand something. She does smile a lot, doesn't she, Helen?
She does.
And she has a very radiant and a very beautiful smile. I was speaking to a group of college kids down in Oklahoma some time back, and one of them asked me the question, will there be little children in heaven, or infants? And I said, well, of course. That's my feeling, that there will be. And they said, well, how could you talk to them? How would you enjoy being around them if you couldn't communicate with little children? Well, a thought popped in my mind that I believe is accurate, that to the mind of God, the mind of a little infant bears identically the same relationship as the mind of an Albert Einstein. And here's my reason for thinking that 1 times 0 is the same as 1,000 times 0, or 1,000,000 times 0, or 1,000,000,000 times 0. Because you can't compare really numbers with infinity. And when you compare our intellect with God's, it bears identically their same relationship as Linda's does. And I know that she has a beautiful relationship with the Lord, and that God understands her deepest longings, even though sometimes it's difficult for moms and dads and the rest of us to understand. Well, Helen, what would you say to a mother who may be going through the same kind of situation that you and Ziden have gone through?
I think just the fact that we do have God that we can go to in prayer and ask Him for strength for each day, because sometimes it seems like it takes a big amount of strength, is a real encouragement. I think too, if we try to just look at things one day at a time, it's easy to look into the future and worry about what's going to happen with Linda tomorrow, or what's going to happen next year, or what's going to happen when Ziden and I are gone. And a person can get really depressed, and we don't know what's going to happen anyway. But I think we've tried to make ourselves just take one day at a time and live it to the best that we can to help her, and thank the Lord for it, and each evening, and asking for strength each morning as we start a new day.
The thought occurs to me that somebody watching this video may not even go to church. It's just almost unthinkable to face the struggles that you've had without Christian friends, isn't it?
Surely is. I can't imagine.
Oh, I just would plead with people who have any kind of a problem to go to a place where Jesus is honored and exalted, because He cares about everybody and their problems. And we were talking earlier, Ziden, it seems that sometimes the brightest and most capable people feel led of God to work with retarded people. Have you noticed that?
Yes. It's been so many people we've worked with are very highly qualified, and as you've indicated other times, they don't go into this kind of work unless they really so choose to do so. And we've been very impressed by the expertise of the people that have dedicated themselves to this kind of service to many people around the world that are hurting with physical or mental handicaps.
As I can hardly believe it, but Bob Tommy is already through with the picture. And let's take just a minute and allow him the privilege of presenting the completed picture to Linda and to you as a family. Bob, I'm absolutely amazed that you finished this picture so quickly. And before we conclude this venture in faith, I want you to have an opportunity to present it to Linda and the family.
That's a likeness of her, but she was a beautiful model. And I tried to get her smile. It's a beautiful smile. but I hope it looks like her.
It is.
Bob, on behalf of this ministry, I'm a volunteer like you are, and without men like you and women dedicated in helping, this ministry would not be possible. So thank you.
This is fun for me.
Wasn't that a beautiful thing to see Linda when Bob handed her that picture?
Yes.
Ziden, we're out of time, but I'm going to ask you, if you would, to look right into the eyes of whoever's watching and make just a heart-to-heart appeal about their life and the Lord.
Perhaps you have been as amazed as I have to see how Mr. Tommy has very quickly captured on the canvas the beautiful smile of our daughter Linda. God in her life has unfolded from what we thought was perhaps nothing into many things that have taken place in her life. We have dedicated ourselves to helping her reach the highest possible function that we can. In fact, it's been pointed out that every one of us has some type of handicap. I don't think you saw it. I couldn't see it. But I know that Mr. Tommy, in his right elbow, the hand with which he painted the picture, has a hinge put in there some 19, 20 years ago, and yet he's able to do what he's done. He's reaching a high potential with that physical handicap. And I would plead with each one of you that if we will love others and reach out to others as Christ did to us, that we can help one another reach our highest potential in Jesus Christ. He's asked us to do that, and I believe that's the thing that has been the most help to our family in dealing with Linda, and that has been loving one another and simply looking at each person that we even know and trying to let Christ work through us and help everyone reach the highest level of potential within their lives. Linda has achieved great things because many people have reached out to her. Might we all reach out to one another and minister even as Christ came to minister to us.